it absolutely makes these repairs. We will absolutely be healthier and have fewer diseases. And if we have diseases, we might have a chance of reversing them. However, we don't have the science to say, and I guarantee you that means you're going to live 10 years longer. Or I can guarantee you won't get this specific disease or that specific disease. When you hear some claims like that, fast and you won't get cancer. Well, a truer story is if you fast, you will certainly increase the odds that you won't get cancer because your body will be undertaking many more of these repairs, but we can't make guarantees like that. So it's certain we're getting a benefit. Hard to quantify exactly how much that benefit is, but it appears to be fairly substantial.
Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing people from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green and sustainable planet for us and all other beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, an athlete and fellow plant eater, here to help optimize and bring into balance nature as it were. Who you heard at the beginning was Steve Hendricks. Our conversation today will be about a widely debated topic of fasting. And while this conversation is about the sustainability of the planet, you can't help climate change if you can't help yourself. And well, fasting might be part of that solution and that conversation. Steve is a freelance reporter and the author of 3 books, one of which has made several best of the year lists. He has written for Harper's, Outside, Slate, and the Washington Post. His most recent release is called The Oldest Cure in the World, which is all about fasting, a topic that has fascinated me for a while. The last episode we did with fasting that featured Dr. Michael Clapper had a lot of you showing some love, so I thought it would be beneficial to bring another expert on to share those points and any of the updated science that we can use to better our life and the choices we make. With all that said, I hope you enjoy the episode. Have your notes app ready for any of the top tips and takeaways you have, because I'd love to hear about it on Instagram. You can reach out to us to further that conversation. But with all that being said, enjoy this chat between Steve and I. Steve, welcome to the pod. How are you going?
It's so good to be with you, Tom. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
Awesome. Absolute pleasure to have you. Look, today we're going to be talking about fasting, and I'll be bluntly honest when it comes to fasting. It is in the field of health, and I find that as I learn more and more about the health industry as a large, I notice there's a lot of things that are snake oily. So while I personally like fasting, I'm very skeptical about it overall. Do you generally find that fasting gets this sort of notion of some people love it, some people don't?
Oh, absolutely. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. Part of it, sort of what you refer to, that snake oil. When you hear about the sort of Silicon Valley tech bros who are fasting in order to, make the next $1 million and screw the next 100 workers or something, then you're like, why are we doing this? Why are we worshiping this thing? There are also, a ton of people who have been told all their lives, women in particular, that they need to eat less, that they need to weigh less, go down the list of all the horrible things we say to people about their bodies. And sure, telling someone, you're actually you're certainly going to be healthy if you incorporate some fasting into your life. It's a hard message to hear with all the other messages we've got out there. And, one of the reasons I ended up writing the book that I wrote about fasting was because I thought that there was a lot of misinformation out there. And it's a lot of that misinformation that contributes to that snake oil kind of feeling that you're talking about. So if we can do evidence-based, science-based fasting, if we can put that information in front of people, I think you lose a little bit of that snake oil feeling.
Well, something I want to zoom into a little bit there is you mentioned the word certainly. Is that something we can use when it comes to fasting? Because, I'm plant-based, and as much as I love to talk about it, I tend to stray away from that word just in case, because I feel like that triggers people a little bit, given how, I guess, complex human biology is. What's your thesis around using that kind of terminology?
Yeah, it does sound extreme, doesn't it? But the science backs it up. So to step back half a step, there are two kinds of fasting, broadly speaking. There's daily fasting, which some people
Mhm.
call intermittent fasting, which is where you just narrow the number of hours that you're eating each day. So you eat in maybe a 6 or 8 hour window, and the other 16 or 18 hours, you're not eating anything, just drinking water. Nothing caloric, no caffeine. That would be daily or intermittent fasting. And then there's prolonged fasting, which is fasting for multiple days, weeks, even months. And in both these kinds of fasting, what the science has shown, particularly in the last decade, there's just been a whole blossoming of the science of fasting. But what the science has made completely clear is that when we give ourselves a break from eating, from digesting food, from processing nutrients, which is a huge amount of what our body is doing every day, evolution has actually equipped us and almost every other organism on the planet with a mechanism to start healing ourselves. Now, our body is making repairs all the time, right? If our body stopped
Mm.
making repairs, you and I wouldn't be here a year from today. So, DNA gets damaged when or gets replicated wrong. It gets damaged by free radicals and things like this. We have cellular parts that wear out, and our body can try to recycle them or just get rid of them and build new ones. Our body is doing this all the time. However, because of that intense amount of energy that's required to process our nutrients all the time, most of these repairs go on at a very low level. So a very curious thing happens when we stop eating. All of a sudden, our body says, well, wait a minute, we're not doing all this. What are we going to do instead? And the answer that it has hit on, for not just us, but for virtually all animal bodies, is why don't we use this opportunity to repair that DNA, to increase the cellular recycling, and many other things happen along the way, such as reducing systemic inflammation in the
Mhm.
body, increasing our insulin sensitivity so that we are moving the glucose, the sugar from our food, out of our bloodstream where it could damage our vessels and into the cells where it belongs. All of these things happen when we stop eating. It's certainly true when we do daily fasting, and it's even more true. It sort of goes into overdrive when we do prolonged fasting. Now, just to sum up here, to your point, yeah, it's certain. This is absolutely a lock. It absolutely makes these repairs. We will absolutely be healthier and have fewer diseases. And if we have diseases, we might have a chance of reversing them. However, we don't have the science to say, and I guarantee you that means you're going to live 10 years longer. Or I can
Mm.
guarantee you won't get this specific disease or that specific disease. When you hear some claims like that, fast and you won't get cancer. Well, a truer story is if you fast, you will certainly increase the odds that you won't get cancer because your body will be undertaking many more of these repairs, but we can't make guarantees like that. So it's certain we're getting a benefit. Hard to quantify exactly how much that benefit is, but it appears to be fairly substantial.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. And I very much appreciate that wording. And something I also just want to clarify, because I do listen a lot about fasting. I've kept a close eye on the space over the past year and 2 years as Sachin Panda's labs does a lot more research, and there's a lot more coming out both with animal models and human models. And something that has really interested me, which you might have a bit more of an insight to, is the more is always better concept, where I used to think, and I was in the camp that when we're fasting, something you mentioned earlier, the day fasting, where you just eat within this certain window. I think it's called usually 16-8, where you fast for 16 hours, you eat 8 hours, and there's, of course, variations on that. But for a long time, I always thought, okay, well, if that's good, that means eating 24 or 22-2 diet, where you fast for 22 hours and eat for 2 hours, is beneficial. What I've found through research is generally that's not the case, but there is a difference between doing a 16-8 and, like you said, a prolonged, like a 5-day one. So when someone's looking to start in the space, of course, with anything in life, I would always suggest starting small. But I wonder what your philosophy is if someone is like, okay, I've heard about this fasting thing through online or whatever. I want to just test test what this is like, how it feels personally to me, and try to find something that works. So with all these different modalities, theories, philosophies, where would someone even begin to explore this field for themselves?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The most frightening emails I get are, "Hey, just read your article," or this book is coming out soon. I'm sure I'll get more of the same. Read your book. I'm going to go do a 20-day fast. That would
Oh,
not be
goodness.
recommended. If you are going to do a prolonged fast, doing it under medical supervision is the best way to go. However, everyone, virtually everyone, I should say, according to the scientists who have done the most research in the field and the doctors who have been practicing fasting for decades in many cases, they say virtually everyone can do daily fasting. So you can do an 18-6, and it's very simple to try. You don't have to change anything about your diet. You can just eat the same stuff you're eating, just eat it in a narrower window. See what you think of it. Your point about, if, well, okay, someone does it and says, well, let me go back half a step. So it can be 18-6, but research has shown, including especially from, as you mentioned, Sachin Panda's lab, he's a scientist at the Salk Institute outside San Diego. Research has shown that you start getting benefits by narrowing your feeding window even to just 12 hours. His research has found that most people in developed countries are eating food across 14, 15, even 16 hours a day, virtually every hour that they're awake. When you start narrowing your feeding window, if you go down to even as many as 12 hours, you start getting benefits. The benefits increase markedly with each hour that you add, each hour of fasting. So if 12 hours, you do 12 hours of a feeding window and that feels good to you, you might try 11, then you might try 10, then you might try 9. And it doesn't mean, move to 11 the next day. Try 12 for a week, see what you think. You like it, try 11 or 10 the next week. Your
Mm,
point is absolutely right on that, well, if that's great, shouldn't we do maybe, there's this OMAD thing you may have heard of, 1 meal a day, OMAD, that people are doing where they cram all their food into, 1 or 2 hours a day in order to fast 22 or 23 hours. I've not seen any science to support that. I've not seen any scientist who says, absolutely, that's a grand idea. The belief is that cramming your food, whatever it is, let's say it's 2,000 calories a day into a single hour or two, it might be just too hard on your digestive system, and the benefits that you get from having that longer fast are outweighed by cramming so much of your food into so small a window.
mm,
So the science is still developing on this point. So I couldn't tell you that scientists have decided on an ideal window, but I could tell you that most scientists who I have read their work or spoken to, interviewed, say 6 hour window or 8 hour window is probably going to be the healthiest way to go. We may be surprised and find that it's okay to go as few as 4 hours. That's possible. And the one
mhm,
other tip, which we can get to if you want at some point, is having an earlier window, eating earlier in the day rather than a later window turns out to be healthier.
yeah. I think the one point I would like to return to that initial thing, because that's something that really struck me as something that's very curious.
Yeah.
But with the 1 meal a day, the OMAD thing, something I found was actually that, especially for someone who is plant-based or looking to maintain that lean muscle mass as you get older, there is evidence to show that dispersing your protein throughout the day on a longer period assists in that muscle growth protein synthesis. So having it at 1 meal a day could potentially not be beneficial. It's just something to keep in mind. Of course, it depends on your own personal goals if you're looking, and your protein needs, of course, depending on your weight. But something you also mentioned is that bell curve of benefits. Usually in life, whether you're looking at finances or workouts, there is a certain, exponential benefit, and then it starts to drop off. I find with fasting, it almost seems to be like an up curve, then slightly down, then up, and then a down, because you get a lot of benefit when you go from no fasting to starting to maybe do that intermittent fasting. and then maybe between 1 or 2 days it's kind of like a plateau region, and then once you enter that prolonged fasting, there's again that benefit, and then once it gets to a certain amount, whether that's 20 days or 30 days under medical supervision, it then either plateaus or drops off. There is a limit, you shouldn't continue. Is that how you would kind of explain the bell curve of fasting? I could be off, this is just my thesis at the moment.
No, I think you're certainly onto something there. Fasting doctors would agree with you, and the science supports something like what you're saying. So, most fasting doctors would tell you if you're going to do a prolonged fast, it's probably not worth doing anything shorter than 5 days. Some might say 6 or 7 days. And the reason is this: that so the it helps to know a little bit about the biomechanics of fasting, and I won't go overboard here, but the short story is, so when you stop eating, you use up all the glucose, that's the sugar that's stored in your body, and you use up glycogen, which is how the glucose is stored in chains in the liver and in the muscles. Once you run through that, you've run through your body's preferred fuel. Your body wants to run on glucose. So once you've run through that, your body starts burning fat. However, and when it burns fat, it breaks down the fat into these byproducts called ketone bodies. Your body uses the ketone bodies for fuel, and that's the state of ketosis, and that's the origin of the ketogenic diet. Most of your listeners are probably familiar with that. However, you don't go straight from burning glucose to burning ketones. There's an intermittent stage there, and when it starts varies depending upon how active you are, how much you ate last, and so on. But at a ballpark, there's this intermittent stage between glucose metabolism and fasting metabolism that lasts about, for most people, from the second day through the third or fourth day of a fast. During this time, you burn proteins for fuel. You're getting a little bit of your fuel from those ketone bodies from your fat, and you get more and more as the time goes on. But during this intermittent phase, you are burning proteins. Now, most people get terrified when they hear that. We have this view that, first of all, we sort of worship protein in our most societies. But setting that aside, many people just imagine their muscles, withering away. Well, we have proteins in every single cell in our body. So many structures in our body are made up of proteins. What scientists and doctors think is happening is, see, when you fast, your body just doesn't eat anything willy-nilly. When you fast, your body chooses, it's very selective about which things to burn. And we know with other tissues, your body will choose to burn the things that are old and damaged first, preferentially. So we think it's old and damaged protein that's being burned during this stage. When you refeed, it's all replaced with, we think, healthy new things, healthy new protein, healthy new structures. So it's nothing to worry about. But until we know more about it, we can't say 100% certain that is what is happening. We can say with certainty that people who do prolonged fasts, their cardiac muscle is not damaged, their, arm muscle, whatever, any of these things that you might be concerned about for essential proteins do not seem to be damaged at all by a fast in the long run. However, until we know more about this, we can't say, you know what, here's what I think you should do. I think you should fast 3 days and go through this difficult period where your body is making this costly metabolic transition that could have some effects if you don't follow it up with these long-term repairs, which would outweigh this cost that you're going through in days 2 through 4. So that's a long way of answering your question. Yeah, there's a lot of benefit for doing a 18-hour fast, let's say, each day. There's a lot of benefit from fasting 5, 6, 7 days under medical supervision for a month, 2 months, if it's called for. Fasting 2 to 4 days, if you do it occasionally, probably not going to hurt you. If you did it as a regular thing, I would question that. We certainly don't have the science to say that that's wise.
I really, really appreciate the wording here, because it goes to what I think we were saying at the beginning, which is this is a very personal thing that you have to figure out for yourself and test for yourself. And of course, if you're going to do something longer than probably 6 or 7 days, seek medical supervision. But what I want to touch on really briefly is, because we've kind of established here that it is a very personal thing, and what works for you might not work for someone else in the complete same fashion. So when we're listening to this, most of us are either plant curious, plant predominant, or plant exclusive. Is there something in particular people following that lifestyle should do when it comes to fasting that's different to someone who's following the more, I guess, conventional omnivorous diet?
No, keep eating plants is the short answer. One of the very interesting things about the history of fasting is that fasting has really come into its own within the last century, but we have a series of fasting doctors going back a couple centuries. And in country after country, continent after continent, era after era, these doctors experimented with, well, when I fast these people, they get healthier. When I refeed them, sometimes their illness just comes right back. So what should I do to keep the illness away? So they experimented with various diets, and time after time, doctor after doctor, they came to a plant-based diet. In the more distant past, it was usually a vegetarian diet, so lacto-ovo-vegetarian with milk and eggs and so on. More recently, the research, and I think very strongly supports a completely vegan diet, a diet with no animal products whatsoever, and usually the more minimally processed, the better. And in fact, when fasting doctors who run fasting clinics have inpatients who come and fast with them for a period of days or weeks, almost all of them will ask you, or well, they'll either ask you to, on your own, eat nothing but plants for 2 or 3 days before you come. Or if you don't do that, then when you come, they will feed you for 2 or 3 days, quite typically on nothing but plants. And the reason is that it's just very easy to process plants because they're chock full of fiber. They're not full of all the saturated fat and so on that slows things down in the digestive tract. And when you're fasting, you don't want that steak or whatever it is sitting in your gut for any period of time. I wouldn't want it for, 2 minutes, but you certainly wouldn't want it sitting there for 2 weeks, not moving through your bowels. So, the emphasis from fasting doctors, and I think the science very strongly supports it, is eat plants before your fast. Coming out of your fast, all the more so, eat plants. The reason being that during your fast, one of the things that happens is your gut bacteria are decimated. Now, that's not a bad thing. They need to feed, and when they don't have something to feed on, they go away. But when they do go away, you get to choose whether the good gut bacteria or the bad gut bacteria are the ones that repopulate your gut. And that decision is made entirely, almost entirely, on what you feed them. Feed them plants, the good bacteria, the fiber-eating bacteria, they will come back. You come out of a fast, you have a hamburger and I don't know, a bowl of ice cream, Coca-Cola, whatever it is, you're going to get the bad gut bacteria. So plant positive all the way with fasting.
Yeah, I love that. And something I would add, I haven't looked into this, but I would imagine it is actually especially useful when you're coming out of a fast to kind of think about kimchi, sauerkraut, tempeh, these things that are loaded with live bacteria. Have you seen any science to suggest that?
Yeah, I've seen conflicting science, so I can't give a straight answer on that. And I even think one of your previous guests, Michael Clapper, who spent much of about 8 years of his career working at a fasting clinic, has recently, if I recall correctly, published something saying, we used to think that these, fermented foods would really be a fantastic thing, and probiotics and so on. The data is more equivocal. So it might well be, or it might not. I don't have data to say either
Jury's
way.
still out. And while we're on the plant-based diet, a lot of people come in to the diet for health reasons. Of course, there are other pillars there, but for those that do, generally speaking, it is, a lot that's touted is actually regarding high blood pressure. And I noticed that you did a video on how fasting affects high blood pressure. Can you give us a quick rundown on that concept?
Sure. So scientists, the very few who have looked at it over the last century, knew for quite some time that just through little anecdotes, when they would do an experiment and fast someone, their blood pressure would drop. It's almost 100%. Every single person who has high blood pressure their blood pressure drops when they fast. If you have normal blood pressure, it usually doesn't drop, it just stays. So when you have high blood pressure and you fast long enough, most people, their blood pressure will drop until it reaches normal. So there was a study that was done, a couple of studies that were done about 20 years ago at the True North Health Center in Northern California by a doctor named Alan Goldhammer, who partnered up with T. Colin Campbell, who many of your listeners will know because he was the author of the famous China study. Um, and they looked at 180 some consecutive patients that walked in the door to True North and had high blood pressure. They didn't cherry pick. They just took everyone who had high blood pressure and saw what happened to them when they fasted. On average, these patients fasted 10 days. What they found, what they reported, was the largest ever drop in blood pressure reported by any therapy whatsoever in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So the average drop in blood pressure was 37 systolic, that's the top number, over 13 diastolic. That's well beyond what you can achieve with the best blood pressure medications. The people with the worst high blood pressure did the best. So those with stage 3 hypertension saw a drop in their systolic pressure, again, the top number, of 60 points, 60. So, I mean, this is just beyond incredible. If you listen to the American Heart Association, if you listen to the National Kidney Foundation here in America, and I'm sure it's true in other countries, they will tell you that there's no cure for high blood pressure. High blood pressure can be managed, but it cannot be cured. I question whether it's just coincidental that they're taking money from the pharmaceutical companies that manage high blood pressure. But setting that aside, the more important point is well, one other thing I should probably add to that. So scientists had long known that you, as I said, could reduce blood pressure, but as soon as they refed people, the blood pressure went right back up. So this little fasting, reducing high blood pressure thing was seen as kind of a parlor trick, right? It wasn't something that lasted. Well, what Goldhammer and Campbell came to, based in part on Campbell's research, was, well, what if we refeed these people an entirely plant-based diet? And Goldhammer's diet is a very minimally processed diet. You can turn your soybeans into tofu, and you can turn your almonds into almond milk, but you can't turn them into Twinkies or whatever, Oreos or something. So they refed them on a minimally processed plant diet and followed up with as many of them as they could. It's hard to track people after they leave the clinic, but they followed up with a third or more of them, and their blood pressure had not gone up after they had returned to eating again. So this is rather remarkable, and the sad thing about it was, as I say, the first of these studies was 20 years ago. Virtually no one knows about it. Walk into any doctor's office in virtually any country in the world, and you will hear that if you have high blood pressure, as in America, 50% of all adults do. By the time you hit your 70s, 3/4 of all adults do. I'm sure it's about the same, slightly less bad, but getting just as bad in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, you name it. And what you will hear is you will be on medications for the rest of your life. Well, you don't have to be. There is actually what seems to be a cure. Now, the one slight caveat to this, all right, is we don't have a randomized controlled trial. Those are extremely expensive to do. So this little, fasting clinic in Northern California hasn't done it. So I can't say with 100% lockstep certainty that this actually works. Maybe there was something weird about the people walking in the door at True North. That's a possibility. They weren't randomized. They were self-selectively fasting. But I will tell you this: every single fasting doctor in every country in every era has had patient after patient after patient with high blood pressure, with the blood pressure dropping when they fast. So I think it's 99%.
And, with that being said, I appreciate the caveat as well, because there's obviously so many variables. And as much as we love RCTs, they are expensive and time consuming to do, although they are, and a lot of times the best form of evidence that we can look forward to in the future. What is the sustainable long-term play in your mind? We talk about sustainability with the environment, we talk about sustainability with your workouts, and fasting is definitely not immune to this philosophy that you can adopt it in a way that is conducive to long-term health benefits. So, for example, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that, doing a 4 to 5 day fast in X amount of time might not be conducive to the best health outcomes. But obviously, with the foundation being it's personal to you, in your mind, for the everyday Joe who's trying to just live their best life, what would you like to see people doing in regards to fasting in terms of frequency? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to do is to eat each day in a narrow feeding window. People who do it find it very easy. It sounds, crazy, especially, if you're used to having your first cup of coffee at 6:30 in the morning when you wake up and you're eating throughout the day and you have your bedtime snack at, 10 o'clock at night. Um, you think it's nuts. What people report, and you can, find it in anecdotes in, places of varying reputability online, but you can also find it verified in studies. What people report is they actually feel that they have more energy and that they're more satiated. They're not as hungry when they eat in a narrower window. Now, scientists think that one reason why they feel satiated is because when they fast for 16 or 18 hours, or maybe even just 14 or 12 hours, they're burning more fat overnight than they used to. When they burn fat, they produce these ketones, as I've said, and ketones suppress the hunger hormones. It's not a huge bump that you get in a daily fast, but it's enough of a bump that people notice. And so these studies find that people are no more hungry than they were when they were eating across the day. And as far as the energy thing, the energy probably shouldn't really surprise us. I mean, how many of us, if you have a big meal, right? How many of us want to go out and run 5 miles? You just want to lie on the couch and do nothing, right? Well, what we are doing to ourselves, it turns out, the science supports that we are effectively, by eating the number of hours. So you can eat a ton of food or you can eat over a ton of hours. And eating over a ton of hours is a bit like eating a ton of food. It actually ends up sapping us of our energy, probably because more of our time is spent, our body is spending more time, that is, digesting and processing nutrients. Take that away, and the irony is you actually gain more energy. There was a period not that long ago when nutritionists would tell you, and some still do, gosh, you need to have a snack every 2 or 3 hours. You got to keep that blood sugar steady. You got to keep the fuel coming. Turns out that's probably not the wisest idea. So yeah, what the average Joe and Jane can do, just try restricting your feeding window. And don't, you'll see so many of these people online, influencers and so on, saying, oh, I intermittent fasted for 3 months and I lost 45 pounds and, blah, blah, blah. Don't make it a fad diet. Just think of it as your new way of eating. And what most people who do it that way report is it's actually shockingly easy. And it's nice to have a chunk of the day without food. Now, if you have huge food issues and you're someone who craves food and you have some food addictions and so on, it may be hard. I'm not saying that this is a salve that it's going to absolutely work for anyone, but it's a tool you can try.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept to pivot to then. Well, firstly, I'd like to add, if you're doing like a really constrained window to say 4 or 6 or 8 hours, I would probably suggest that it is important to either well plan the nutrients or take a supplement to make sure you're hitting all that maybe I would even add that regardless of fasting. What do you think in terms of supplementing while you're fasting? Is that a thing that comes up commonly?
Yeah, so if you're doing daily fasting, you don't need to do any more supplementation than you would do, if you're eating in an 8-hour window, let's say, then if you're eating in a 16-hour window. You should be eating more or less the same amount of food. Now, what actually happens, and this is why people lose weight, is they actually eat a little less food. And so slowly over time, people do lose weight on these intermittent fasting narrowed feeding windows. But, assuming you're getting enough calories a day, maybe for one person, it's 1,500 calories. Maybe for another person that's doing a lot of exercise, it's 3,000 calories. But whatever it is, if you're getting enough calories to stay at a healthy weight, and you're eating a varied diet, you don't need to do any more supplementation on an intermittent fasting protocol, a daily fasting regimen, than you need to do in normal life. Now, of course, those of us who are vegans know you need to be taking a vitamin B12, right? If you're doing, for example, the diet that I mentioned that Alan Goldhammer does, which is no, minimally processed stuff, and that includes no added salt, no added oil, no added sugar, you're probably not getting iodine. So, because comes to most of us in table salt or through dairy or something like that. So you may happen, if you're one of those people, to need to take an iodine supplement. If you're me and you live in northern Colorado, you need to take a vitamin D supplement. But these things are true whether you're fasting or whether you're not fasting. Now, the one caveat to this is where some people do make mistakes, and I will say in the past it has been a fatal mistake, is to take supplements while doing a prolonged fast. And this is one reason why you should fast under medical supervision if you're doing it for many days. And it makes sense. People think, oh, well, we're not eating, so maybe I should help the body out and give it some potassium. Maybe I should help the body out, give it some, I don't know, sodium, give it the vitamin B12, get it vitamin C, whatever it is. So in the past, doctors who were running experiments with fasting for obese people to try to help them lose weight, this was back in the 1960s and 70s, largely in the United States and the UK. These doctors made the error of giving these supplements to people. And the problem is evolution has not prepared our body to go into this very evolved fasting metabolism, be taking no food, just water, and yet somehow be getting these micronutrients, these little doses. And so the body, to sort of oversimplify things, but the body gets confused. And the body says, oh, well, we're kind of fasting, but maybe we're not fasting. So it changes its metabolism somewhat in unhealthy ways. So I'll give you an example. So we're all familiar with scurvy. That's what happens when you don't get vitamin C, right? Sailors on the seas in days gone by, died, probably more of scurvy than any other cause out there on the high seas until people discovered you should take some citrus with you on your sails around the world. So if you take someone and you fast them and you give them vitamin C, well, first of all, let's say you don't give them vitamin C. The body says, okay, we're fasting. We're going to conserve all of our vitamin C. All right. They don't get scurvy. If you give them a little vitamin C, your body, which has these stores of vitamin C, says, oh, we got nutrients coming in. I'm going to dump my vitamin C. So it dumps its stores that it would otherwise be holding on to during a water-only fast. But now you've got a water and vitamin C fast, and it thinks it's going to be getting all these nutrients and so on. Those people get scurvy. Exact same thing happens with supplements of thiamine and its disease of deficiency, which is beriberi, which no doctor ever sees beriberi anymore if they don't work outside some, really poor tropical area. But you can induce it by fasting and giving people supplements. And there have been cases where supplementation during prolonged fasts has led to fatalities where people have died. The most famous instance of this was known as the protein sparing fast or the liquid protein diet, which was a modified fast that was promoted back in the 1970s. And the theory was, hey, well, you're fasting, you're not getting any protein. We need protein, right? So they would give people these mega doses of protein. These were sold in powders, just like protein powder now in the supplement aisles of grocery stores all over the world. And what happened was people ended up breaking down far more protein on the fast than they would have had they just been fasting without getting this weird supplementation during their fast. When they refed, it was discovered that the cardiac muscle, their heart muscle, had been severely damaged by this protein dump. And 60 people over the course of several months in several countries died when they were refeeding coming off of this protein fast. So that's a very long way of saying, but I think a very important thing to note, supplementation during a prolonged fast, probably a bad idea. And if you have a supplement that you think you need to take, that's why you need to discuss it with a doctor, and they can tell you whether that's harmful or not. For the same reason, you never want to do a prolonged fast without supervision if you have any illness, if you're on any medications whatsoever, if you suspect you have an illness. But taking medications while fasting, another no-no.
That was going to be my next thing. Medications, I assumed, fell under the same camp there. But I want to be very specific about clarifying this. A prolonged fast is how many days?
So most doctors will say it's anything more than 24 hours.
Okay.
So more than one day is a prolonged fast.
All right.
Now,
Because I had thought
so
it
now,
was like 5 or 6.
yeah. So definitions vary, but that would be the most common definition. Now, fasting doctors disagree about whether you can fast on your own for a few days. Most fasting doctors say, yeah, no problem if you're in good health, you're not on medications, you don't have a diagnosis, it's okay for you to fast for up to 5, maybe even 7 days. Other doctors will say, no, no one should fast for more than one day ever, unless they're under competent medical supervision of someone experienced in supervising fasts. And the reason they say that more than anything else, there are two types of people who physically cannot fast. They are extremely rare, vanishingly rare. But the fact that they exist does lead doctors to say this. And the reason is some of them can't burn proteins. And you'll recall that I mentioned there's this period, but as you're moving into ketosis, where you have to burn some proteins, they can actually burn them, but they can't handle the byproducts of them. And those can throw them into a coma and they can die. Another group of people just cannot burn, they cannot use their ketones for fuel. They can burn the fat, break it down into ketones, but then it gets there and they don't have any fuel. So, the only recourse then when there's no glucose and no fat is your body's going to tear down its protein, and eventually it will tear down some essential proteins. So those people also can go into a coma and die as well. Most people who have these conditions know who they are. So that's why some doctors say, look, this is an exceedingly rare thing. They know who they are. Healthy people can fast for a week. Other doctors say, no, we don't want to take the chance. No one should fast for more than a day without supervision.
I get it. I really do. Obviously, it is they take like that vow to do no harm and to act in the best interest of society. But there are other, conditions and side effects. Some are normal, some not so much. And I didn't know that there were side effects associated with fasting. And when I put up the video of Clapper, a lot of people loved it on YouTube. And one of the comments were regarding this fella who had acid reflux when fasting. And I found that quite fascinating. And after doing some research, there were some studies to point that this is actually a common symptom. And when fasting, you should potentially pair that with chamomile tea to help alleviate that symptom. Do you have any, warnings of what are normal side effects and what are not normal side effects?
Yeah, so it's very hard to give a definitive list, but I will tell you a few things. So when you fast, this is not, I wouldn't say this is a hard and fast rule, but it is a much more true than not rule. If you're having a lot of symptoms, fasting doctors believe, and this is based on clinical experience, this is not based on, deep peer-reviewed studies, okay? But it's still valuable information. But they believe that the more side effects, the more symptoms that you have, it probably indicates the less healthy you are. Or you don't have a lot of weight to lose and you're pushing your limits of your fasting too much. But for most of us who have too much weight or plenty to lose or whatever, if you're having a lot of symptoms, it's typically, they believe, because you're going through some form of healing crisis. Your body is working to heal itself, and these are the side effects of it. Now, the fasting doctor's job is to figure out what's a perfectly fine side effect, just a normal healing crisis, stick with it a couple days, you'll get through it, and what's something that signals danger, right? And for one person with their set of symptoms, their particular medical history, what's perfectly safe for them, you're just having a headache and nausea, that's common, might be trouble for someone else. So that's why I can't give you this is safe and this is dangerous. What I can tell you is that the most common side effects of a prolonged fast are things like headache, nausea, fatigue, skin rashes. Tons of people get those. The biggest danger for most people in a prolonged fast is not, people worry about, gosh, is my liver going to be eaten away or my, lose heart muscle? It's not that. It's passing out. Because remember, I mentioned this blood pressure dropping. So everyone's blood pressure drops some. And quite often, when you're maybe, say, 2 to 3 days is when it starts for most people. When you stand up when you're fasting, your blood won't stand up with you. It won't get to your head fast enough. People quite often who are not familiar with this or, haven't been warned about this side effect, they'll pass out, they'll conk out, bonk their head, and then they're in the emergency room for stitches or something, or they have a concussion. So that's the biggest danger. There's a very simple way of addressing it. Fasting doctors say what you need to do before you arise when you're fasting is just pump your legs, just up and down, up and down. That will get the blood flowing through your body, and then slowly stand up in stages, always aware that you will need to sit right back down if you start feeling faint or woozy. Do that. Most people have no problem with it, but that's actually the most common
that's a
trouble when people fast at home. Yeah.
It happens to me all the time when I get past that, around that 24 to 30 hour mark, and I stand up and I'm like, oh my goodness, what is happening? Another thing that I found quite normal every time I've attempted I'd say plus 30 hour fast is like a headache or not feeling super focused. But then when I talk to other people, and my fiance, when she gets past that 35, 40 hour mark, you start to get that back again. So it seems to be temporary and very temporary at that, but still a few hours can feel like quite a long time sometimes.
Yeah, the most difficult part for most people, I think, does correspond with that period where you're making the transition from running on glucose and glycogen to running on ketones, and you're burning proteins. Here's the interesting thing. Your body doesn't just burn proteins and use it as fuel. It can't do that. It has to go through this process that's called gluconeogenesis, which just means creating glucose from something else. So it actually has to turn those proteins in the glucose. Our body really doesn't want to do that. And so, whether it's sort of by evolutionary design that it wants to make fasting very uncomfortable for us, so we go out and look for food, I don't know. Whether it's just a weird side effect, who's to say exactly how it came about? But the consequence is most people feel like crap during days 2, day 3, maybe day 4. Some people, particularly if they're unhealthy or if they are, slightly underweight, just feel terrible all throughout their entire fast. I think most people have the reaction that you have had, which is, yeah, I get through this period, I feel better. And then, you do have a ton of people who just become hyper productive during a fast. They've never felt such energy and such efficiency. It's almost a form of mania. And there are probably some neurotransmitters that are at work there. It could be just freeing them of previous burdens that were holding them back, and that was their underlying personality. Who knows? But the point is that many people have many different responses to a fast. But the most common is, yeah, there are some difficult times. You struggle through them, and you end up on the other side, and it's pretty good.
Bit of an analogy on life, that one.
Yeah.
Look, Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Your new book is out where everyone can get their book. Can you give us a quick 1 minute on your book and where people can get it?
Yeah, so the book is called The Oldest Cure in the World, Adventures in the Art and Science of Fasting. It's being released in the United States on September 6th. It's being released in the UK on October 13th, and I am lobbying my publisher for an Australia-New Zealand release as well. I don't know what that's going to be. There will also be a Spanish version that will be released in Spain and Latin America sometime very far in the future once they've translated it. And the short story about the book is that it's about the history, the science, and my own experiences with fasting. And yeah, you can get it wherever you get books. Alas, at the moment, not in Australia, but I hope soon.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today, mate, and good luck with everything. For anyone who does want to connect with you, I'll leave all the links to do so in the show notes. See you next time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening and or watching the whole way through. I really appreciate it. if you want to go ahead and connect with Steve and or grab his book, I'll leave the links to do so in the show notes below. And if you wanted to connect with us, you can head over to Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, wherever you like, whatever platform you choose to participate in, we're probably there. And I appreciate if we could continue that conversation over there. Fasting is something that's really intrigued me. And for any very specific fasting questions, of course, you can reach out to Steve, who is very around the latest science in a very non-biased and, I suppose, data-first manner. With that being said, I will see you on next week's episode. Stay happy, eat plants, peace.